So then over to our next speaker, Carlos. You will present us what you have been doing in the Share More project. Please, the floor is yours.
So I'll just start. I'll continue to talk a little bit in line with what Anna just presented. Different experiment, different topic, still focused on behavior change. So definitely engagement with stakeholders and citizens here in this project. So this is a one-year project that is still ongoing, started in January. It's called the Share More project and it's funded by the EIT Urban Mobility. It's focused on understanding how can we make car sharing a little bit more sustainable by focusing on behavior. So understanding the preferences that people have for car sharing and how can we incentivize them to change behavior and to use car sharing in a different way. The project has 7 partners. 3 cities are involved in this project. It's Munich, Tel Aviv, and Copenhagen. So we have the municipalities of these 3 cities. We have a university in each of these 3 cities. So TU Munich, Technion University from Israel, and us, DTU, in Copenhagen. We also have University College London as a university partner working with us on this project. So on the DTU side, Mayara that is here, so you guys online probably don't see the audience, is the key person working on this project. So all the tough questions that anyone has, I'll just try to escape and redirect to Mayara. I'm just kidding, don't worry. So the presentation goes briefly with a background on what car sharing is and what's changing. I'll give an overview of the Share More project and what we actually are doing. Then I'll talk about 2 steps of our research. One, which focused on interviews and focus groups. So here, basically, we wanted to get the first wide impression about how people and the stakeholders that are part in the urban mobility sector, and especially in car sharing, what are their views on incentives? So what's missing? What can we do for people to change a little bit their behavior? And this, of course, then allowed us to have a little bit more view from our just intuition from the authorities and the policymakers and the municipalities working with us, and from the research that we've done in the past, and then design a survey for users that we can then deploy in large scale in these 3 cities, and ask actual individuals what they see car sharing and how they behave related to it. And I'll talk a little bit more about what specifically we were asking. And I'll present a little bit the most recent results. Those are not final results. The project is still ongoing. But I'll talk a little bit about what we are still doing and will do until the end of the project. So this is, for you, car sharing, we did a lot of work on trying to define it. So it's not carpooling, it's not Uber, it's not Lyft. It's basically when a service where you can use someone else's car for a limited amount of time. Think about the rental. But then the car sharing services can be they vary depending on a lot of characteristics. So depending on where and can you pick up the car and drop off the car. So things related to where can you park the cars. Who owns the vehicles? Is it the commercial company that provides the service that owns the vehicle? Are private individuals that want to rent or lease their cars for a limited amount of time? How can you pay it? Do you have to pay by the hour? You have to pay by the day? So actually there are very different services here in Copenhagen, in Europe, elsewhere that vary in a lot of these characteristics. And because they vary on different characteristics, then of course they are limited. So it's limited depending on the characteristics of each service. So for example, some of them are limited to a certain area. Some of them you have to drop off in some stations. And there, probably it's far, all the stations are far from the actual destinations you want to go. There are some limitations in terms of efficiency. Sometimes you don't have a car available. Sometimes you cannot book. And so it's very different from owning a car. And usually, although it's still an individual, let's say, mobility mode, most of the time private, but doesn't need to be private, it's still very different from owning a car. And then there are also limitations in terms of the integration, and this is actually where it's moving, of these services for a more holistic mobility service at the urban level. So the way car sharing is integrated with the other modes in a city and how they go for more efficiency from the sustainable perspective. But still, we can see that, so these are the numbers that our colleagues from UC Berkeley, they actually periodically collect information and very interesting numbers about sharing economy, and especially on car sharing, how these modes are increasing in terms of fleet and in terms of users across the world and by region. And since 2012, there is a steep increase in terms of the people that are subscribed to car sharing services and the actual availability of services worldwide. And I don't expect that this will continue to go up indefinitely. I mean, there are limits on the demand, and it's still not clear where. But all this flexibility and the changes that you see in technology and in the service available to us is actually a high potential of getting this curve still going up for quite a while. So what we focused in our project was basically in 4 steps. So I briefly mentioned it already at the beginning, was first try to get an elicitation from stakeholders about their needs regarding car sharing. So this includes very different stakeholders in a city. And I'll mention it who we tried to contact in the 3 different places that we were working on. But basically try to see, okay, so how do you view car sharing for your institution? What is it missing? What does it have that is good? And what can we do to change it towards your needs and interests? Then, after we did this first analysis, we then go and start to do a large-scale user-based survey. So here it's basically going to travelers and trying to understand, okay, do you know about car sharing? How do you view it? Do you like it? When do you use it? Have you used it before? And then specifically targeting incentives. So if we did this to the particular car sharing services, how would you react to it? And by this, we change the way they operate. We provide some kind of incentives for the users, targeting specific behavioral changes. And that's where we are. We finished the survey. We've collected the data. I have data from a few weeks ago, so not the final data set, but we are still processing it. Then what we are now doing, and our colleagues at Technion in Israel are designing an actual incentive scheme that will be then deployed with a local car sharing company in Israel and piloted for some time. And so the idea is basically from this old survey, we understand the preferences across 3 cities. We understand even a little bit in more detail what's happening in Israel. And then we say, okay, so for this particular city, we'll talk a little bit about why some incentives are better than others in some particular services and cities, and try it out and see, okay, what will be in practice the outcomes of actually deploying incentives. So step 1 was focusing on stakeholder analysis. So we basically managed to get a focus group with existing users of car sharing, people that have never used car sharing, and people that have used it in the past. And we basically sat with them for a little bit less than 2 hours. We're recording the discussion. We had a script where we had 5 main questions about the engagement. So exactly when they start using car sharing, or why did they not start to use car sharing, what's their situation, their view on the particular service of car sharing. On demand-related incentives, so how can we change the way you use it? Then on supply-related incentives, what does it work or not work on the operations of car sharing? So you can think about things like, why don't you try a different vehicle? Is it the problems of cleanliness or comfort in the car? What if we give you something for you to use cars on an off-peak? How do you use it, for example? And then a rating of the incentives. So we asked them, okay, what if we had to provide all these incentives to you? How much of these would be important for you specifically? And they had to rank between 0 and 5. So the way we did the sample, it's a small group of people in each city, but it was a convenient sample. So we tried basically to get as much possible as different heterogeneous individuals, so we can capture a bit of variability and get information about what should we put then into the survey to get confirmation and actual preferences. So this is basically an exercise that helps us in designing the survey. It doesn't get information about real preferences of individuals because the sample is not representative. We did the same with stakeholders. So we met with public transport operators, car sharing operators, environmental NGOs, consumer NGOs, so the associations of consumers, or local authorities and regional authorities, and real estate developers. And here we didn't do a focus group. We went one by one, sat with them face to face, or some of them virtually because then COVID came. And we recorded the interview, same thing, a little bit less than 2 hours. And with a script similar to the discussion I presented before, but targeted to stakeholders. A little bit different in terms of the questions that we ask them. Both of these two both the focus group and the stakeholder interviews, what we did after we collected the recordings, we transformed it into abbreviated transcripts. We selected all the quotes. So this is like a sentence where a person tries to give us an idea. Then you have to code and label what the idea that the person says in these discussions and classify it in terms of what would be the potential behavioral change and what's the potential incentive that relates to this idea that the person has done. So it takes a lot of manual time. So this is the usual or a classical method, let's say, for processing interviews and focus group data that one records. So it's usually very qualitative analysis. Even if you define a little bit, try to do some criteria about the process. Some of the folks in our group, in the whole team, is actually working on trying out some automated method to extract this information out of these transcripts. So what came out? So briefly in a summary, so from the discussions with the users, clearly there was the need for targeting the relationship with car ownership. So the fact that a lot of the people are used to have cars as an available mode. What does it mean? It's very convenient. You can have it whenever you want. You don't have to go through all the hassle to deal with an app, checking with real-time information and real-time availability and the frustration of getting there. So basically it's, some of them actually require that, okay, this is a good thing. How can we make car sharing going towards that kind of facility to the user? It's not the same modes, but we have to find ways on how to make it happen. Then there was car sharing coverage. So the necessity that you need to travel sometimes to places that are not covered by the area, and sometimes actually the car sharing is not available in my neighborhood. So people, it's basically similar to other transportation. Public transportation is not available to everybody. You have to walk a little bit longer to get it there. So here it faces the same problem. The car sharing fleet, it's basically the availability of different types of vehicles and how can you use them for different purposes. And here there was a clear difference between the cities on how users would perceive the need for having this flexibility. And then interestingly, both users and stakeholders shared the need for incentives for easier parking, the need for flexible and clear pricing schemes, and the need for service and technology integration with other modes, other payment methods. So these three things came out as a clear need from the users, but also the stakeholders. So the people involved both in policy making and operating the car shared services said, no, we need to handle parking is a big problem. We need to sit down with the cities to solve the problem of parking. So that was the car sharing operators. Pricing scheme, same thing. Service integration, that's basically how the car sharing operators, for example, notice that for us to reach different populations, we need to make sure that we are able to integrate with public transportation services. So cities outside of Copenhagen, for example, for us it's very hard to operate, so we need to find ways to work with authorities to, for example, to have a good link to public transportation, especially to rail. Also the stakeholders on the other side suggested, well, we need clearly for us to get our service more efficient and eventually some profitable at some point. We need to make regulations and work with the authorities to make it happen. We need to actually be reachable. A lot of people don't know that the service exists and is available to them. So having ways to incentivize this is important. And working towards equity and sustainability. So that's still a lack. It's not in their priority of policy making and operational strategy. And that was identified by them that they know that they have to go towards these goals. And they might need some incentive with the authorities and the regulators to walk towards these goals. So this is a big table, which of course I'm not going to go through it. There is a report that is the first deliverable from our project, includes a lot of the data that I'm showing, and it's available to you, I believe. And this is basically the scoring. So for the 3 cities, Tel Aviv, Munich, and Copenhagen, how the users would perceive different incentives. And you can start already to see some differences, for example, in availability of electric vehicles, where in Tel Aviv was clearly not a priority for being incentivized, while it was in Munich, and likewise for group packages and accounts. So meaning that the account is not owned only by you, you can share with your partner, with your families, and of course then usually these packages are have different rates, more convenient. And of course here there was, and I'm pointing to 2 lines above the last red one, there was clear difference between the cities. Then we got all this data. We said, okay, so now let's make an online survey. So here basically it's people were recruited, and I'll mention a little bit how people were recruited, but basically they would go into this online forum. You have an introduction about car sharing, socio-economic questions about your age, income, your family status, all of that. Then we ask about travel, your current travel patterns and how you move today. We asked about how you view these incentives, so the same kind of questions on how do you perceive different incentives for car sharing. And then we had, and step 5 in the survey, we asked people with an experiment. So we present you with different subscribed packages of car sharing and ask which one would you choose. Different costs, different types of car sharing services, peer-to-peer, free floating, station-based. And then we also provide incentives along with all these characteristics of different car sharing subscription packages. And so we collect all this information. Finally, at the end, by the way, because we got hit by COVID when we're doing the design of the survey, of course, we included a little bit on, okay, tell us how you were moving before, how you're moving now today with the COVID situation in your specific community, and how that, and how those preferences for selecting is affecting, and how COVID is affecting your preferences in your decision-making of travel. So the sample is big, so we targeted at least to have 100 car sharing users, but of course then we've tried to get as much as possible. So we got, so these numbers are a little bit old, so we have a little bit more now, but still we got around 543 in Copenhagen, around 500 in Munich, and almost 250 in Tel Aviv. Here we try to follow different representative demographics. So in Copenhagen, we try to follow a bit the representative of the entire population. In Munich, they try to follow a little bit more representation of the city center, so it's biased towards people living more closer to the center. And in Tel Aviv, they focus a lot more on car sharing users, for example. So here we have to be careful about how we analyze these different data sets. So this is how the different cities and the users scored the incentives that we show them. Clearly pricing and flexibility come as the top incentives that needs to be taken care for people to use a little bit more car share services. Interestingly, service-related factors, which is mostly related to availability and coverage of the service, were a clear need in Tel Aviv. Same thing, for example, on electric vehicles, and electrification was a clear problem for a clear incentive in Munich and Copenhagen, and not so much in Tel Aviv. And an example was an incentive that we tested was, what if you get some incentive in taxes if you were actually subscribed to a car sharing service? And while this was very welcome in Tel Aviv, in Copenhagen and Munich, people said actually, aha, but why should people that still drive a car get tax discount instead of public transportation, for example? And so there was all these things that came up out of the survey, which are very interesting and where to go. And here was a last exercise, and that's, I think, the last data set on, that we have on car sharing in this presentation, where I mentioned that we had asked people about subscribing to a specific car sharing package service. So we said, you have to choose between these three, and they had to do a few of these experiments. And at the end, we said, okay, the best one, or the one that you prefer is this one. And how much would you change your current travel pattern that you specified in a previous question if now you had access to this specific package? Right? And people then, we say, okay, I will do more trips of work, do more trips of leisure. Of course, this is stated. We have to do the pilot experiments to make sure that how realistic are the stated preference. But basically, they told us how much would they change the number of trips that they would do in an average day. Actually, it was per week. So there were some quantities that we put there for the different incentives. So we had a long list. And here you can see some of the incentives that were more selected in the package level and what would be the impact of them in terms of trip making. So for example, you'll see that having a family friends account with discount rates would actually have an increase in terms of trip making, both in Copenhagen and Munich, and a much less increase on how people would make actually more trips because of this incentive in Tel Aviv. Same thing for collecting credits. You can think about points that you can exchange for goods and services, for example. So if you use this service, then you get points. And clearly there was a little bit less increase of trip making compared to other incentives in the two cities, and also much less in Tel Aviv, for example. So this is still numbers that we are now digesting and analyzing. And hopefully in the final deliverable report, we can have more interesting numbers, especially the fact that we have all these other attributes about costs and travel times associated, which I'm not showing here in this analysis. So I'll skip a little bit the COVID for the purpose of time. There are some interesting results that we are still analyzing, but it's a little bit different from the car sharing topic, although we use the same survey. I'll jump a little bit to the fact that we need to have packages that are specifically designed.
Carlos, we don't hear you anymore.
Commercial car sharing operators, they are still not doing it. So meaning that if I go to Share Now or Green Mobility or other car sharing company, I will see the same packages as you will see when I log in. So there is still not yet any personalization aspect or clearly targeted users, although some of the areas, for example, that they operate are already targeting specific groups of users. For example, here in Copenhagen, you will see that these companies already operate in hospitals, in campus of universities, and in the central region. So that's targeting specifically user needs to go to these specific hotspots. So what's coming up is the car sharing incentives in Tel Aviv and the pilot. So hopefully we'll have at the end of the year some interesting results on this. They focus a lot on the operational setting of the car-to-go operator. So here they try basically to see what will be the impact in terms of pricing for having a more balance and overall more available cars to the whole population. Yeah, so and that's my last slide. A few things, so the two first bullets are already mentioned. A third one is the importance on authorities to help designing the incentives with the stakeholders. So again, we looked at both user-targeted incentives and stakeholders' incentives. So this means how these operators can make a better operation overall. And there's a clear role that authorities will have to play. So especially when we look at parking and service integration, of course, they'll have to be involved. We see some efforts already on the field being designed, but here it's very interesting from this project on where it should go, it's quite clear. And personalization. And here users will better fulfill their travel demands. We managed to get personalization out of this. So other service in the carpooling industry are already doing it. Operators will retain and attract users and increase efficiency, and cities mobility through a better use of its mobility resources. So I think that's all I have to say. Yeah, any questions?
Thank you very much, Carlos. Very interesting.
Bernadette, how do you want? There's one question here in the audience. Just.
Please, I would like to ask the audience to put the questions in Slido. Please use Slido so that we can take them into the discussion. You don't hear me?
No. Maybe now we can. Bernadette?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Carlos. As for the question in the room, I would actually like to ask everybody to post your questions on Slido. Please use it, because after the next presentation, we will have a debate, and we will try to get your questions in as well. So please put them there so that also the online participants can see it all and that we're all on the same level here. But Carlos, just one question, because then we have to move on to the next speaker. Well, I was actually wondering, like, what is actually benefit of that you get out of all these incentives, and can you quantify those? Can you already provide some insights on that?
Not yet from this research. There has been research on incentivization, and if you relax just not the car sharing, but getting to more sustainable modes, so incentivizing people to use either car sharing, either more public transportation, either pulling together. Usually incentives can, you're not going to have shifts or savings of 50% of congestion or 50% of reducing of car ownership unless you have heavy regulation along with it. Usually the studies that worked with personalized user-targeted incentives such as rewards, points, some benefits in the middle of using a more efficient service goes between 5 to 20% in terms of emissions or congestion, depending on which one we are talking. So in previous research, you can, I think incentives should be seen as a tool in policy making that is complementary to other interventions. So it cannot be seen as, you know, a single alone policy that will solve the problem.
Okay, thank you, Carlos, very much. Before we go to the next speaker, I would like to actually go to the poll results. So what is the main barrier for the implementation of citizen engagement? We see that 20% has voted on the aim and the purpose of participation are unclear to the citizens. So it's often not clear why they should actually be involved in there. Another one that has 15% of the votes is fear by policymakers that citizens will demand things that cities cannot deliver. Interesting, actually. So it's interesting to see how the different perspectives are here. Citizen engagement is too expensive. There's one vote on that. And an important one, 15% has also voted on lack of capacity and skills of people implementing citizen engagement activity. I think this is a very relevant one because we're still learning by doing, right? And also 31%, actually the most votes were on usual suspects are involved. So this is actually a problem. So marginalized communities are often not reached. So how to actually make sure that we involve all parts of society and not just let's say the usual suspects. So thank you all for voting here. And then I would actually like to also now post the last poll. And this is a word cloud. So what is the biggest challenge to implement citizen engagement? Please provide your views on that.